Now, if you're lucky enough to be eating an oyster in Australia, it's most likely one of the 2 commercially produced varieties here. Now, I've got one of each right here. Now, they can be a little bit hard to tell the difference, but there are some really distinct differences between the 2. Now, number 1 is the Sydney rock oyster. It's endemic to Australian waters and is grown specifically and exclusively on 1,200 kilometres of the New South Wales coast. Now, this little guy, it is the Pacific oyster. It was introduced in the 1940s, grown all over the world. It was introduced for aquacultural purposes. So one of these 2 oysters is the one that you're most likely enjoying. The Sydney rock oyster takes about 3 or 4 years to reach maturity. The Pacific oyster, more like 1 to 2 years. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can tell the difference between the 2. First, ask your oyster supplier. Ask them, am I buying Sydney rocks or am I buying Pacific oysters? They should know. There's a couple of visual differences. The Pacifics tend to be a little bit bigger and a little bit more frilly, but that's not a fail-safe way to identify them. The number 1 way to tell the difference between a Sydney rock oyster and a Pacific oyster is around the hinge there. If you run your finger once you've shucked it, just around there you'll feel there's little serrations, like little teeth on the Sydney rock oyster, whereas on the Pacific oyster, they'll be totally smooth. Now, each of them has a unique flavour. I find that the Pacific oysters tend to be more minerally, a more simple flavour because they're a little bit faster growing, whereas the rock oyster tends to have a little bit more complexity, more fat and more mineral. So go out, try both, find your favourite, but if I had to pick one, it's the Sydney rock oyster all the way.